George Gein, Ed's father, had a pretty crappy childhood. At the age of 3, his mother, his father, and his sister were caught in this freak flash flood in Wisconsin, and they were killed. As he grows up, he deals with this huge loss by drinking, and he becomes a full-blown alcoholic. His mother, Augusta, was raised in a very strict Lutheran home. So Ed Gein's parents both have like some childhood traumas going on, and they get together and get married, and their marriage wasn't great because of Augusta's religious beliefs, though. Divorce was not an option. Also, because of the way sex was presented to Augusta when she was a child and growing up, she always kind of viewed sex as something very dirty. However, she does get married, and obviously she has sex because she has Ed. She actually ends up having 2 children. So, on December 17th, 1902, she has a little boy named Henry. And the birth of Henry really does not help the marriage she didn't want them to play with anybody else but each other, basically. She definitely did not want them to be around girls and become interested in them because she felt like every other girl or woman except for herself was a whore. So as a young boy, Ed tried in vain to please his mother, not realizing she's an impossible woman to please. Once, she had given him some money to go to town to buy some groceries, and on the way there, he lost the money. He was terrified to face his mother and tell her the truth, so hours and hours go by before he dares go home. And he finally, gets brave enough to go home and tell his mother that he lost this money, and her reply was, "Ed, only a mother could love you." This kid was separated from pretty much everyone else. He didn't have friends, he wasn't allowed to be around other people, and he really craved his mother's love, but she was extremely stingy with giving it to her children and showing them any kind of love. When Henry and Ed were children, she made them swear on the Bible that they would stay virgins their entire lives. When Ed was young, he was playing outside and happened to walk behind his parents' store, and they were slaughtering a pig. It was hung up, and they were cutting it open. In 1913, Augusta saved all of the money that she had made from running the store, and she moved her family to a small dairy farm. And this had been her dream, to live on a farm. They lived away from the town, away from people, because according to her, they were all tainted with the devil. They move again a year later to another farm that's further away from town, and this farm was just outside Plainfield, Wisconsin, and it was 195 acres, so a lot of land. Augusta made sure her kids kept very busy. She hovered over them and worked them pretty hard on this farm, making sure to keep a very tight leash. She didn't want them having friends or extra time to get into mischief. In the meantime, their father just drank and drank. He was abusive to the children when they were younger, but as they grew up, he stopped hitting them. In 1940, George Gein died. Ed and his brother worked on the farm, but the farm wasn't making much money, so the brothers began going out and taking various odd jobs to try to bring money in. Ed would sometimes babysit children. He would read to them and play with them, and he was a great babysitter. In 1944, this wildfire breaks out on the Gein farm, and I've read some conflicting reports on this, but I think a lot of them point to the fact that they were trying to clear some weeds, so they set a fire that got out of control, and the brothers are rushing around trying to contain this fire. Ed goes back to the house after they kind of get everything under control, but he cannot find Henry. Henry's head, but there were no burns on his body. So this is really weird because he was outside, so it's a little harder to die of smoke inhalation when you're not like trapped in a home. But they did say he died of asphyxiation. It's just weird because he wasn't burned, so he wasn't trapped in the fire, but they write it off as he died because of this fire, and no foul play was ever suspected. And Ed seemed like such a good guy. Honestly, no one thought anything of this. This was just written off as an accident because Ed Gein would never hurt anybody, let alone his brother. It is reported that Henry had been putting a little bit of pressure on Ed, so Henry realized the way they were raised, the way that their mother was keeping them reined in, was not normal, and he was encouraging Ed to leave, to move out, to date, to make friends, and Ed just felt like this was not acceptable. This was against what their mother had been teaching them. Then this fire breaks out and Henry dies. So while Augusta really just kind of seems like a stone cold bitch, the death of her son really affects her, and she suffers a stroke. She's taken to the hospital where Ed Gein stays by his mother's side, does not leave her. He's reading the Bible to her and caring for her until he's able to bring her home. And then once they're home, he takes care of her around the clock. But in December of 1945, she suffers a second stroke and dies. When Ed's father and even his brother died, he seemed okay. But the loss of his mother is a different story. At her funeral, Ed Gein was seen wailing like a child. Now Ed is alone on the farm, and he stops taking care of it. He stops taking care of himself. He wouldn't shower, and people would say they could smell him like if he entered a store. And soon he was just the town weirdo that people began to play pranks on. Once a smoke bomb was thrown into his truck. They once poured brandy into his beer, and then they laughed when he took a drink of his beer and then made a face. Ed continued to work odd jobs, and he also ended up leasing out parts of his farm to make money. He was very much living a very lonely life. He began reading a lot, reading medical anatomy books, and I feel like this is never a good sign. He was also really into true crime magazines, and he would read anything he could get his hands on about cannibalism. Ed had boarded up some of the rooms inside the house to help preserve them. He wanted them left exactly as his mother had left them. But the rest of the house just started filling up with junk and garbage. He was a major hoarder. Then some weird things began happening. So there is this tavern owned by a woman named Mary Hogan. Mary is this middle-aged woman with a very thick German accent, and Ed was known to frequent because the next day is the opening of the deer hunt, or like the opening of hunting season. And Frank, Bernice's son, says that he is planning on going hunting. He is gonna go out first thing in the morning. So the next day Frank goes out hunting, and this is when something bad happens to Bernice. Frank is hunting most of the day, and when he gets back, something is happening at the store. So the store clerk is missing. There's no one in the store, and it's locked, but all the lights are still on. Now this is the first day of the hunting season, and it's one of the busiest days the store has in the entire year, so it doesn't make sense that his mother would have closed it up. Frank can't get into the store because he doesn't have his key with him, so he runs home and grabs the key and comes back. And he goes into the store and he notices the cash register is missing. The next thing he sees makes his heart start pounding. One blood stain, then another, and another, and as he's following these blood stains, he realizes this trail of blood is leading out to the back door. Frank's very first thought was, Ed Gein did this. The sheriff is called, and Frank tells them that he knows Ed Gein is responsible. And then he gives the sheriff this receipt, so they kept every receipt from every customer. And on this day, there was only one receipt before whatever happened, which meant only one person had been in that store. And that person had come there to buy antifreeze. So they decide they're gonna go to Ed's house, but Ed's not there, so they begin looking for him at all the places he's known to frequent. But in the meantime, one of Ed's neighbors had needed a ride into town, and he had asked Ed if he would drive him. So he's like banging on the door, and Ed comes running out of the house, and his arms were all bloody, and he's like, sorry, I'm just dressing a deer. Let me go wash up. Then he goes into his house, cleans himself up, and he takes his neighbor into town. Then he goes over to this neighbor's house to have dinner. No one knew Ed Gein didn't hunt deer. It was the beginning of hunting season, and nothing about this bloody encounter with Ed Gein was unusual. Soon, the news of Bernice's disappearance has spread through the town, and even the Hill home, which is where Ed is having dinner, hears the news. Bob, the Hill's teenager, asks Ed if he'll drive him to the store because he wants to see what's going on. And Ed's like, okay, I'll take you to Bernice's store. At the same exact time, the police are coming to the front door of the home, and they want to know if Ed's there, and the Hills are like, yeah, he's around back, he's officers go to Ed Gein's house. They enter Ed's shed, thinking Bernice is being held captive inside the shed. It's dark, and they have flashlights, and they're looking around, and one of the officers bumps into something. He turns and shines his flashlight in the direction to see what he had touched, and the flashlight illuminates a headless body hanging from the ceiling. The body had been cut from crotch to sternum and had basically been hung up and gutted like you would if you were cleaning out an animal. A wooden crossbow had also been run through both ankles, and ropes held the arms out. After finding Bernice's remains, authorities don't really want to go in Ed's house, but they have to. They enter, bracing themselves for what they may find. The house is a disgusting mess, but there's also a lot of really creepy things in this house. Police find bowls made of skeleton heads in the kitchen, skull caps on bedposts, noses, bones, a string of nipples that looks like it's like a rope. They find a lampshade made of human skin, face masks made out of human faces. There were 4 chairs completely covered with human flesh. There were flesh bracelets. You know, the string you pull to like make your blinds go up and down. On the bottom of that, like the blind, I don't know what you call it, but the thing that you like grab onto to pull your blinds down, there was a pair of human lips, gloves made from human hands. There were 10 female heads discovered inside Ed Gein's house, and I know I called Fred and Rosemary West's home a house of horrors, but this is like a whole new level of a house of horrors. Police found Mary Hogan's head in a paper bag. Bernice Warden's head was found in a burlap sack. When they first take Ed to jail, he just refuses to speak at all. They bring in evidence of what they find in his house, and then he decides to speak. And his first words are, quote, "Can I get a piece of apple pie with a piece of cheddar cheese on it?" So they bring him this, and he eats it, and then he begins talking. He admits to murdering Mary Hogan and Bernice Warden. He admits to stealing corpses from several local cemeteries. He said that between 1947 and 1952, he had made 40 visits to cemeteries to dig up recently buried bodies. He said that he would get in these daze-like states, and then he would go dig up the bodies. He exhumed 9 bodies from the ground. He admits to killing the 2 women, but there were 12 skulls found in his house, so 1968, Ed Gein's doctors found him fit to stand trial. So a trial begins and it lasts 1 week. He was found guilty of first-degree murder, but he was considered legally insane. So he basically gets sentenced to live the rest of his life in a mental institution. On July 26th, 1984, Ed Gein died inside the Madonna Mental Institute. He died from respiratory failure secondary to lung cancer. So he gets buried in the Plainsville Cemetery, but over the years, like, people would come to his grave and they were like chipping off pieces of his headstone to take as like little souvenirs. And then, so his headstone gets chipped down, it's getting smaller and smaller, and then someone comes in and just steals the entire headstone. That was in 2000. So later, this headstone was recovered in Seattle, but the decision was made not to put it back, and Ed Gein is now buried in an unmarked grave. So that is the story